And we're live! Hello all and welcome back to Sigil Spotlight. My name as always is Mr. Harlan Guthrie, and I am here with the lovely and talented Ms. Jo Fallick. How are you doing today, Jo?
I'm doing great. How are you, Harlan?
I'm doing great! Doing wonderfully. Today, as you may have noticed, we are back with another tips and tricks video. I don't know why the laughter, but it felt more appropriate than another round of applause. That's right. What are tips and tricks? Well, here on Sigil, we like to try to give you advice as much as we like to take advice. Because it's true, we like to take advice from you, the viewer, from the listener, from the subscriber, from the reader, from those who use our virtual tabletop products, and those who are currently supporting Hereafter on Kickstarter, which is now done. But those who did support it, it's a fantastic game that we are streaming every Tuesday at 7:30 if you're curious exactly how it plays. But yeah, what are tips and tricks, Jo? What is this sort of series of videos about?
Well, Harlan and I are seasoned game masters. I think I can say that now. And so this series is hopefully going out to people who need a little bit of advice. Maybe
they don't even need it.
Run
you know
their games.
Like sometimes, and I think you're definitely this kind of personality where you don't need the advice, but you enjoy
seek
learning. It. Well, but like some people just they become sponges and they're like, oh, I want to learn more about what's going on, and I want different opinions.
You're calling me a sponge?
I'm calling you a sponge. I mean, there are two types of people: the people who are like, I loved school, and the people who are like me. And
I'm a school person.
So maybe this just comes down to those of us who really enjoy learning and expounding their knowledge about this fantastic pastime that we all have. So we're excited today to talk about 3, count them, more exciting categories in your RPG endeavors. We are going to be talking about the art of improvisation, mastering the game, and bringing new players to role-playing. Now, we've sort of talked about these in ways before. If you've watched the first 2 episodes in the series, we've covered game prep, we've covered RPG etiquette, we've created memorable NPCs together. We've also talked about developing a campaign, contingency planning, and building player characters. And to a degree, elements have been touched on these before. In game prep, we talked about how to talk to your players as if it's the first time they've played. In RPG etiquette, we've talked about how to deal with that as well. In building player characters, we've talked about sort of bringing new players to role-playing. But these are going to be more drilled down into the categories specifically, which I think is going to be really exciting and enticing.
I'm excited.
You what?
I'm excited.
No, you're not.
So our first topic, the art of improv, is one that I think you really excel at, Harlan.
Me?
I personally have some trouble improvising on the spot. When I run a game, I like to have as much as possible prepped out. I want a kind of, anything that I can imagine happening, I want to prepare for it and I want to write it down. And Harlan is a fly by the seat of his pants kind of guy.
Well, not necessarily. And I think that's a great segue into that category. So, what is improvisation first and foremost? Jo, lay it on us.
Here I am.
The Websters.
Improvising, a definition for what improvising means. It means thinking on your feet, I guess. Harlan's looking it up right now, so yeah. I'm just stalling at this point.
Improvisation, the action of improvising.
You're welcome. You're welcome, everyone.
There you go. That's it. An act of improvising or composing, uttering, executing, or arranging anything without previous preparation. So without previous preparation, I think is sort of the little...
That's a nugget.
Jawbone is what I was going to say. Doesn't make any sense, but it felt natural for some reason. I feel like there's got to be some, boat terminology of the jawbone. It's like a thing that pinches the lines. I'm getting way off topic. The art of improvisation. What is it? It's about flying by the seat of your pants a little bit. It's about going off script. Why is this important to know, Jo? Why is it important to talk about improv when we're dealing with RPGs?
Well, because honestly, that is the whole point of RPGs. When you sit down around a table, the kernel of what an RPG is an improvised storytelling session with other people. And the elements that could be governed by chance are essentially decided by the roll of a dice or some other mechanic. But the kernel of it, when you drill down at its center, is about improvising a story.
Well, and it has to be, because at the end of the day, the freedom that an RPG gives you, the ability to walk in a certain direction, we're not computers. We don't have the ability to have everything laid out. So you need to be adept at improvising in order to make the world fully fleshed out and feel real, in order to make a role-playing game feel kind of limitless.
Additionally, I think that when you're sitting down to play an RPG, you're at a table with, 3 or 5 other human brains, that they're going to do things that you're not going to be prepared for, no matter how much you try to organize your notes pregame.
Yeah.
So getting good at improvising is a really helpful tool. Now, there's nothing wrong with stopping in the middle of a session and saying, give me a minute, I need to think about what would happen next.
Absolutely,
Or, you opened door number 3. I didn't plan that far. Just give me a second and I'll come up with something. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
No, and in fact, sometimes, worrying too much about what happens when you get there can really impede the story that you're trying to tell. But like any skill, the more you practice it, even in small doses, the better you become at it. And
how do we practice improvising?
How do we practice it? Well, okay, so we've called it the art of improvisation for a reason. Why? Because it is an art. There's a certain amount of free-formedness, expressionism, the way that you're deciding to improvise. That's important. The golden rule, however, I think, and what you would boil down a lot of improvisation coming down to, is saying yes. What does that mean, saying yes? It means that you are encouraging people, when they're pitching you things, to say yes to bring them to the next level. You're setting up a marketplace scene, okay? And your PCs, and obviously when we speak of the art of improvisation, we're speaking on both halves, but in this example, you're the GM, and they're looking to buy from a vendor. They're looking to buy a sheepskin rug because they want to lay it down in Liam's tiny hut that night. Well, the player walks up and says, oh, yeah, I want to buy a sheepskin rug, Well, typically, if you're a game master and you've, predefined your story, you might be like, well, no, there's no rug shop here. Why would they sell rugs? Or you might say, well, I don't know, maybe the rugs are too expensive or something like that. It's so much easier to say yes. And why is that important? Why, the power of yes, they talk about a lot. But not only is it important because you're saying, okay, let's see where the scene can go, which is such an important thing when you're improvising. You're giving space for the story to start to take off, but you're also encouraging your players to contribute to the story in a meaningful way. And that's really the healthy part of improvisation, is that you're encouraging people to bring their own flair to it. But what does it mean in your story? Well, it means that you're setting yourselves up for more exciting possibilities. That sheep's rug can now come back in a meaningful way if you are, making a jot down of it. And similarly to when the dice decide something fails, you jump over a pit trap and you're expecting the players to jump over this pit trap and the dice say no. What happens when they fall? Now, the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, it kills you, it does this damage, and then you climb out. But in saying yes to failure even, you're also opening yourself up to a wide world of possibilities that could be down that tunnel. Do they hit the spikes and take the damage? Or have the spikes started to erode themselves, and when they hit that ground, they actually fall to a cavern below? Do they land on the spikes, but they're made of sponge, and they turn and they see there's a passage that can lead them off the beaten path? Adding that kind of creative flair makes us not only excited to find out what comes next, but also breeds an environment of storytelling that encourages more people to throw more out there.
Couldn't agree more.
Couldn't agree more.
I was just thinking about other things that I would do in those situations while you're talking about them.
Yeah, just to kind of mess it up.
Oh, no, I was just hoping that we could improv.
Do it.
You and me.
What else would happen? Huh?
Well, if you're the player and you wanted to improvise with that failure, you don't just have to be like, oh, okay, fine, I take that damage. Take the damage and do something with it, right? Like, oh, my leg is hurt now and I'm walking with a limp, or maybe I'm leaving a trail of blood behind me, or, You can as a player take things that the DM gives you and say yes to them as well and continue to improvise on the other side of the screen.
Absolutely, which brings us to the next point of the art of improvisation. So saying yes being sort of the tippy top of that iceberg, and then contributing to the scene. That's the second part of this sort of, it's easy to say, okay, I want to buy this sheep rug. And then the GM says, yeah, okay, there's a sheep's rug staying there. What do you do with it? You're like, oh, yeah, I put it in my bag of holding.
I buy it.
And then you never do anything with it. Well, what are you adding to the scene? Are you just doing it because it's fun and interesting to you? Well, that's not really aiding. And when you're saying yes to people, it's about enhancing what you're working with. It's about building on the foundation that the GM is laying down. So think of ways that you can be adding to that scene. If an example that happened very recently in one of our games, a player went up to buy a potion, which were far too expensive. So another player came up and decided to steal one of the potions for that player. The GM, in this case was Joe, could have very easily said, well, no, the roll is too high or whatever, but let the dice fall where they may and allowed it first and foremost, saying yes to the possibility of having someone steal. Well, the steal succeeded. So the potion vendor lost a potion. The person who stole it walked away with it. And the angry player who couldn't buy it, kind of pouted by the fountain. Well, instead of just letting it lie, the player in question that stole the potion contributed to the scene. They elevated it. They took the potion that they had stolen and secretly gifted it to the player that was angry that couldn't afford it in the first place. So the player who just looks down and sees this potion arrive out of thin air is excited. They lift it up. Well, again, it could have just ended there, but in contributing to the scene, the player in question decided it might be an interesting shot, or the DM rather, to infuse the scene with a little bit more chaos, that the guards spotted him. Well, now all of a sudden the guards are involved. The player who stole the potion is nowhere to be found, and the player who was angry at the potion seller is now on the hook for this potion that was stolen because, well, he was angry at me and now he has a potion, and all of this brewing chaos is erupting in this amazing improvised session, all because the potions were a little expensive. And all of this
You're
comes,
welcome.
Yeah, all of this comes by saying yes and working on crafting a story, contributing to a scene to make it grow. And there are so many examples of this. And if you are the kind of player or GM who thinks that you don't improv or you don't improv well, I guarantee it's just a matter of you not realizing the moments that you're improving, because it can be as minimal as saying, yeah, you know what, you of course you change your hair to being that color, and then having an NPC notice, oh, I like the color of your hair. You're allowing it, you're growing it, you're letting the scene become its own thing based on people offering ideas out there. Now, it's not just enough to say yes, and it's not just enough to contribute to a scene. I think the other pitfall is a lot of people contribute to a scene and they say yes, and they don't move the scene forward. And this comes down to sort of the storytelling of the GM, because at the end of the day, a story only works if you're moving in it. A campfire at night is great, and you can improv for hours around it as your player characters pull out different things from a haversack and tell funny stories, but you're not actually pushing it forward. And there has to be a point where eventually you're not only adding to the scene and saying yes, but you're also moving the story forward.
Something happens.
Something happens, or the suggestion that you have enhances it. So a bunch of players are sitting around a fire, Joe, for and they're improvising, they're having fun. You're the GM. What do you do? How do you move it forward?
1,001 ways. You hear a sound off in the distance. It sounds like a wild animal of some kind. Tempt them into leaving the campsite, or introduce a new character. Sees the fire from a distance and comes by. Excuse me, can you spare a meal? I'm a hungry traveler. Yeah. Interject. Give your own shape the narrative, I suppose. Give your own improvisations to the scene.
Now, this wouldn't be the art of improvisation if we just talked about what improvisation is and how to do it. To me, what elevates just doing improv and then making it something that's really, really special in a game is finding a conclusion. It's very easy to walk up to a shop and say, I want to buy a rug. And the GM saying, yes, you do buy a rug. And you buy the rug, but then you knock over something and it breaks, and then you need to haggle about how much it costs. That's all great. But the art comes when you find a conclusion to that improv, whether it be at the market, whether it be later that night, as the player character rolls out the sheepskin and finds something inside of it, or rolls it out and finds a button to end that improvisation on, a note that makes that scene feel like it not only belongs in the story, but is part of the story. And that's what elevates just improv to becoming an art. And those are difficult things when you're starting out, to understand how something comes full circle. Because you're searching for the end in the middle. Because the art of improvisation is that you don't really know where it's going. And great improv comics and sketch shows do this all the time. They'll be halfway through it, they start seeing the end, and they start working towards that. And that's something that you as a GM can be doing. Let's say your friends are improvising by a fire and you introduce a character. That's great. You've done your improv. This character is a tiefling wizard who's angry. He can't sleep because his campsite 3 over is being, done by this rowdiness. Okay, well, the players improvise back and they say, well, we'll challenge you to a poker game. And whoever wins the poker game can stay up as late as they want and as loud as they want, and blah, 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 blah. That's great. You now have this wonderful improv. But now you need to start thinking about, okay, but where's the end point on this? Where's the point where we tie it all up? And it's not easy. We had a situation in a game recently where one of the characters, a mage or a wizard, changed a fire giant into a slug. A wonderful move. It cut combat in half. Very, very fun. A wonderful improv that the GM said yes to, that created a really fun scene. But where does it end? And it was interesting because we all sort of broke the narrative for a second to talk about different ways that it could end. One person suggested, well, we just stand over the slug and we shoot it and it dies because the fire slug or the fire giant dies that way. Okay, that's not bad. Another player suggested, we get a familiar, a bird familiar, to fly it up high and drop it. Kind of funny. Another player suggested, well, let's just leave the slug behind and we just walk off into the sunset. And none of them really felt right. And it was an example of, us not thinking far enough in advance, because sometimes improv happens very quick and the end comes very quick. We ended up finding a great solution to it, which ends up being a kind of a fun little scene in our story. But unless you're thinking about that while it's going, it becomes really difficult sometimes and can bog down. And that's why finding the conclusion to an improv is the artful part of it.
It's tricky. It's a lot of stuff to try to keep in your mind, especially when you're trying to manage combat, stat blocks, a map, character voices.
Absolutely.
Encounter tables, all of that. But I'm trying to take notes in my own head so that I can improve my own GMing style. I would say of all of the GMing skills and attributes, improv is probably my dump stat.
No, not at all. I think it's just something that, we each get different times to explore and practice. It's a muscle we flex at different times.
Very true.
And if it comes down to it that the conclusion isn't quite there, or you can't figure it out, but you still want to be artful with your improv, it comes down to then knowing when to end or change a scene. I think George Costanza from Seinfeld always says, end on a high note. He tells a joke, whatever joke gets the biggest laugh, he walks out of the room immediately, even if he just came in. Because that's the feeling you want to end a scene on. And there's no reason to treat anything differently. If you get a really uproarious laugh, if you're improvising and the scene and the players are dangling on the edge of a precipice, they're all clinging to a rope as a snapping giant crab at the top is attacking. And it was there because of improv. And they all share a look and someone says a line that just slays it. Smash cut to them being on the road somewhere else.
Yeah.
End on the note that makes sense if you can't find a nice conclusion. Because that's all that really matters. That's what a conclusion is. Some general tips, if you're looking to find more ways to improvise, have a strong setting with many options, nothing too finite or boring, make it really full of flair. And what I mean by that is, Of course, you can start your adventuring party walking down the road to Neverwinter, or you can have them at the grand gala event on a ship floating 200 feet above a massive city, and somebody's just been murdered. Which of those do you think is going to invoke more improvisation?
Yeah.
Not only are there more characters and the setting is more fanciful and colorful, you're bringing about the notion of being inspired by having such a diverse setting.
Help your players improvise with you. Give them props to use. Give them an exciting location. Give them a profession. Give them the same way that people will shout out suggestions at an improv comic at a comedy show. Provide them with those jumping off points.
Absolutely. And then finally, encourage exploration in an improvisational way through reward. Role-playing boons, positive reinforcement. Almost every major system now has a way to reward your players for doing certain things. And improvisation is a skill like any other. And the more it gets stretched and practiced, the better anyone becomes at it. Rewarding that in a role-playing sense is great. It's a great way to not only make your stories better, but also make your players better at telling those stories.
Absolutely.
So that's the art of improvisation, mastering the game. Now, we've talked about being a game master. We've talked about being a player. We've talked about game prep. But what is mastering the game? It's really about understanding where your failures are in managing a game. And to me, this comes down to a number of different pitfalls that a lot of us have. And honestly, one of the biggest, I would say, issues that early GMs have, and I think we're for the most part pretty comfortable at it now, is managing time. Managing time when it comes to many, many different aspects, whether you're sitting at a table at a convention, whether you only have 4 hours to play a game that night, is one of the most difficult things to really fully, truly grasp, because it's about expectations, about knowing your players, how quick they are on their turns, and more or less we're all working within time constraints now. Whether you're playing a game with your friends, or if you're playing a game on a stream or something like that, being mindful of the clock, having elements to add or cut as needed, and ways to combat slower, distracted players are all, I would say, mastery level things that first-time GMs don't really have to worry about. So
Absolutely.
Being mindful of the clock, Joe, what does that sort of mean to you?
When I first started running games for strangers, I was mostly doing Adventurers League games, and those are very heavily time constrained during convention play especially. So I would have my phone out on the table with the clock app just going, so that I could constantly be monitoring the progress of how far the game was going. I knew from my session note prep that I wanted the introduction to take 15 minutes and the first combat was going to happen around the first hour. I had all of these sort of timelines in place, and it was helpful for me as a beginner, but I think as I've grown more accustomed to the game and to running games for people, you can sort of start to stop watching the clock that closely, because you get more of a feel for it. I know that if I'm sitting down for a 3-hour session, unless things go bang, 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 I'm not going to be able to fit in more than one combat.
Yeah.
Just because I know my players. And so it comes down to, I guess, understanding how familiar you are with the game, and then just the expectations of the players at the table as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also mitigating the issues that you might have by having segmented pieces of the game that you can either cut or add. Tell me honestly, how many times have you thrown in an extra combatant or removed one based on how the combat is going and how long
Absolutely.
it's taking?
All the time.
These are things that longtime GMs most of the time kind of do without thinking. Very few GMs now have a block combat saying, well, that's it, that's what it is, you either take it or you leave it, unless it's a really, really important battle or they're terrible at their job.
There's nothing better than a bad guy evolving to have a more powerful second form, or for reinforcements to come on the battlefield, or if things are dragging, for all of the enemies to just run away,
Yeah.
or you
Yeah.
know, fall into a trap or something. Like, you can manage time creatively for
And
sure.
that's it, you know, and making sure that you are managing that time is so important for some of the other pitfalls that you know, as the more you GM, the more you'll start recognizing, which again works towards slow and distracted players, you know. Slow and distracted, those are two very separate columns.
Aw.
So slow players, what?
I love slow and distracted players.
Well, but I think they're both important, and I think they're both individual enough. You know, slow players, you know, in an ideal world, every player in the game would have absolute agency. But that's not how good stories are told necessarily. Now, does that not mean they can do whatever they want? Of course. But there's also an amount of how much of the story lens is a player taking. And that's when it starts to tip. Because sure, there's nothing wrong with this player saying, you know what, I want to take a bath. And while I'm in the bath, I want to contemplate all the things that are happening. Well, that's great. But there's 3 other players in the game that want to move on to the next thing. So how do you combat slow players in a game that is meant to invoke the idea of absolute agency, the ability to do and take your time at doing anything? And that's when we get to mastering the game. That's when we get to managing time, keeping the story on track, you know, and still allowing the player to have agency. It's difficult. I've done many different versions. I've had it where, okay, cool, this player will stay here and the rest of the players will move forward. Most of the time that player ends up realizing that they're kind of hogging too much of the spotlight, and they end up joining, or they don't and they lose out on the game. Or, you know, if the other 3 players are sort of into it, this goes back to that improv. And this is where it's not an absolute science, you know? Let's say for a second, the one player's like, you know, I just want a bath day. I just want to relax and do something like that. And you're like, well, look, I planned this schedule. You know, I planned this session. We got goblins around the corner. We got a dragon fight coming on later tonight. And this guy wants to sit in the bath. Well, what do the other players want to do? If they're like, yeah, you know what, actually, this sounds great. Your 2 options are here. You either fight against the current. You say, well, guys, you know, I think we should move forward and do some combat, which is absolutely fair. But communicating would be the easiest way to do that. Say, well, here, guys, this is what I have planned. Or if everyone is really set on doing this, then you just go with it. And it goes back to the art of improvisation. You say, okay, sure. You say yes. All right, well, what kind of things do you guys want to get up to? It's sometimes more work because you're also trying to now, oh, wow, I was planning one thing and now I'm spinning wheels. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. But it's important to, you know, to recognize that players have agency in a game like this.
It's not to say that you need to abandon all of your plans in favor of allowing your players to just take your game and do whatever they want with it at the expense of your fun.
Yeah.
You can certainly meet your players where they want to be that session and then introduce elements that you had prepared, or things like Harlan was saying about you can improvise on that, but don't just allow them to have their 4-hour bathtub philosophy session while you sit there, I guess, just watching them all have a conversation in character together. That can happen in a group chat.
Yes.
Somewhere.
Well, and that's the thing, you know, there's ways of managing it. There's no perfect way. Depending on your group, talking to them, dropping the guys and say, so guys, here's what I planned for today. If we want to do this, we can do this, but I don't have anything planned. Do you guys have enough sort of stuff that you feel really interested in talking about in character? And the answer might be an overwhelming yes, in which case, great, do that. But, you know, also communicating with them and saying, this is what I got planned, and then being like, oh, wow, that sounds really fun. Yeah, no, you know what? Let's push on and we'll deal with how that works in character, or let's just have a meta discussion about why I don't want to do this, and we'll keep moving on. And that's, you know, slow players exist and they have a right to, and it's important to let them feel validated for wanting to take the game at their own pace while recognizing that they're part of a party. The other group is player distractions. Now, there are some easy ways to do this. You know, no phones, no distractions other than the game that they're playing. Try to be respectful. Put your stuff in a bowl by the door with your keys and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, unless you are twisting someone's arm to be there, combating player distractions is a really difficult fine line to do, which kind of comes down to your own individual line of how much you want people to pay attention to you. I know I've personally just been like, I don't really want to play with this group, or let's just call it here for tonight, because people are just not interested in doing it. And that's okay. Sometimes groups don't work out because of those reasons. Sometimes people just need a bit of kick in the pants.
Sometimes people have trouble focusing on something as complicated and abstract as Dungeons and Dragons for more than a couple hours at a time. And I know personally, I've sat down to play some long ass sessions of D&D, Pathfinder, whatever. And, hour 5 rolls around and everyone else at the table is still thrilled. And I'm like, I need a break. Yeah. My brain is just not here anymore. And it's nobody's fault, but becoming a distracted player happens to everybody.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing, which comes back to communicating, talking to your group, talking to your GM, being like, I wouldn't mind a break around here, or I can't do sessions for more than 4 hours, which is totally viable. We're old now. I don't want to do that. Player distractions. They're always going to be an issue. There's no absolute right way to do it, because honestly, distractions depend on the player. They got a valid reason. They could be like, I'm just worried right now about, this family member, and I can't focus and I can't do any more of this. So, so that's dealing with mastering the time. That's one of our first categories of mastering the game. Another big category under mastering the game is how to keep long-form games interesting. You've been out there. You've been GMing. You're on your campaign. You're now trucking along. How do you keep these long-form games as interesting as the first time you played them? Well, there are some easy ways to be helpful at the end of every game. Joe will talk about those, and in a positive reinforcement way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you want in these long campaigns, you want to reward your players for being loyal to you. It's really hard to get a good group of gamers together, people whose schedules line up, and I think it's really helpful at the end of the session to go through what just happened during the session and to compliment each other and to appreciate each other. A little bit of positive reinforcement goes a long way, as Harlan was saying, with improvisation. And it's really helpful to stop for a second and say, hey, Harlan, when you were interacting with that rug vendor earlier, it was hilarious the way that you decided to go full bull in a china shop and knock down 55 things and come up with silly excuses for everything that you did, blah, blah, blah. I just think you did a really great job. It's so fun to play with you when you're in such a silly mood or whatever. And it really helps people feel like they're contributing to the story and that they want to come back and play more.
Yeah, absolutely. Also ending on a high note. If you're ending a session, if you're going to do another one, try to get something really positive, an upswing, so that you leave the session wanting more. And then finally, and this has worked a number of times for our long form games, is assign roles. Timekeeper, calendar keeper, monster tracker, something that
quartermaster.
Yeah, maybe the player or even the character can be in charge of. That kind of gives them a responsibility outside of just showing up and playing.
Yeah.
To kind of make them feel important. Lore master,
map maker.
I know we've had in fact, you've played a game, Joe, where you sketched all the creatures that you encountered. You played a character that was new to the world, and you kept a notebook, a real life notebook, where you would draw pictures that I would give inspiration for. And I know in our personal game, we have somebody who manages the calendar and really likes tracking all the days of the weeks that passed and the holidays and stuff like that. So there are ways in the verse, in the meta of the story, to also be including players and encouraging them to want to keep coming back. Every good story has an A plot and a B plot. And no different than, your story should have an A plot and a B plot. The game and the world can have an A plot and a B plot. Give yourself something to do alongside it. Maybe you can just ask somebody to be helping you with the map prep or something like that to give them sort of a job. It keeps long form games pretty interesting.
But going back to the A plot and the B plot, when you're running these long form campaigns, it can be a real great source of material to stop focusing so much on what you as the GM are planning and start asking your characters, what do you want your character start asking the players, what do you want your character to achieve in this story? Do you want them to find love? Do you want them to become a hero of legend? Do you want them to be a tragic character? Should they lose something dear to them? Should they make a great discovery? Like, what do you want?
Yeah.
And then start working with them so that you can help them achieve that storyline that they want to experience. Because it's impossible for you to understand what everyone at your table is going to be most fulfilled by. So in these longer campaigns, it gives you an opportunity to sort of craft a game that's going to make everyone's dreams come true.
Absolutely.
D&D's awesome.
Well, all RPGs are awesome. Mastering the game. Setting up encounters. Now, encounters are something that if you've been a long time RPG aficionado, you have done hundreds of, So at the point of mastering, how do you master an encounter? What are the things you're looking for? Are random encounters even worth it anymore? A lot of early books sort of make you roll on a table and that's what you pick and that's kind of where it goes. But how do you keep that fresh? How do you keep that from getting stale? Well, first and foremost, are random encounters worth it? Absolutely. Because you don't need to just subscribe to, a pack of wargs attack. This is where you get to tell your creative flair. This is where you get to make mindful decisions that not only make combat fun, but also can enhance the story. You have free reign in terms of where these take place. Is it an ice storm? Is it a frozen lake? Is it pillars that are across a lava-drenched floor below? Are the creatures mundane? Are they magical? Are they flying? Do they seem mundane, but they actually can fly? There are sometimes scenarios that we write off because we see them as purely combat encounters. And I think we miss out on the possible story that we could be telling during that. I remember we played a game once where I was a life cleric, and during it, there was this small creature in a cage. And during one of the rounds, the hag took the small creature in the cage, which was innocent, and threw it into the river. And rather than just a straight up combat, it now became a moral dilemma of saving the drowning creature or continuing the fight. And there are so many boundless opportunities to be enhancing a regular combat with story to keep them fresh and interesting. And I think what happens is, especially as we become game masters who master the game, is we become really convinced that we sort of can do it all in a nutshell. We can all be our own everything. And the amount of times that I've reached out online or bounced ideas off other people just to grow my own experience, or even taken ideas from movies and things like that, has helped so significantly.
Absolutely. When you think about like the Mines of Moria and how that encounter starts in the tomb with the sound of the drums from the deep, and then an arrow comes in through the room, and then there's just hordes of, spoilers, guys, but there's orcs down there, goblins and a cave troll and stuff, and then they flee and they're pursued and rocks are falling, and it's so dynamic. Yeah. How can you not want to take elements of an encounter like that and infuse that into your D&D game?
How?
Not just the environmental stuff that's happening, but like the feeling that those characters must have been going through, that desperation, the adrenaline, right? The loss.
So setting up encounters, many ways to do it. Random encounter tables are a great jumping off point, honestly, genuinely. I think we ignore them as we become masters of the game. But looking at those and then building in subplots. The more you know your characters, the more you should understand what they want out of a scene. The characters, not the players necessarily, which you can also cater to. But, if you have a character who is looking for a long lost son the entire campaign, well, guess what? One of the combatants in the next combat can remind them of him. Terribly so, perhaps it's him. There's so many ways that you can be building story into straight up combat encounters, and I think it becomes really easy to forget that.
Absolutely. It's so simple to look at a stat block and be like, all right, it's goblins. It's just a whole bunch of them. They all have this many hit points and these are their ACs. But when you look a little bit closer, you can infuse it. Maybe their armor is reminiscent of a place that one of the characters has been. Oh, maybe he knows this tribe of goblins, or potentially they have something on them that's going to, I don't know, some kind of artifact.
A magic wand.
You never know.
There are so many things that we could talk about when we're talking about mastering the game. But when it comes to our sort of block of what we've experienced and what we're always trying to get better at, I would say the last big pillar for us is environmental storytelling. So often we walk through these environments in game, the forest. How often have we been on a forest path? It's countless times. But we forget that the setting is a character in the story as well.
Of course.
Letting the world speak for itself is such a vitally important thing that is so easily forgotten. And you think of games, like Elden Ring is a great example of a game that is so rich with storytelling in its environment. The way you walk past a massive fallen head of some stone giant from eons ago, And the best part about certain aspects of this too is that no matter how much your players may choose to want to interact with it, without an NPC, there's no onus on you to have to tell any more.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of keep it vague, And sometimes you're playing in worlds that exist and you think that you don't have the ability to. Well, no, I can't add a fallen city in the middle of Faerun. No, you do whatever you want.
Yeah, you get to invent as many things. You think that's just the number of towns that there are in Faerun? No.
There's at least 2 more.
All over the place. Just create your own shit.
I mean, imagine for a second, here's a great exercise. You're playing a game, you're running a game as a GM, and you want to tell the players that at sunrise, the entire, Earth will freeze. How do you communicate that without an NPC? It's a difficult problem. There are ways around it. And that's kind of the fun of doing it. How do you tell them? Is there sort of a wetness to the trees, as if they've thawed that morning? And those who watched Here After the First Fire will sort of know of the environmental storytelling that I had sort of tried to do in that, in the ways. The wood is darker, the thaw has came, the animals are ancient because, or the fauna is ancient because of how long it's been frozen. There are really interesting and clever ways that you can be building out such a rich story and such a rich setting by making the creative decision to add more to something that typically is just a backdrop. Mm-hmm. And that really is about, again, mastering the game.
Absolutely.
So again, we could talk about mastering the game for hours, and perhaps it's a part 2 that will come in the future, but we want to finally speak about bringing players that are new to role-playing into the game. So we've talked a little bit about this before. I think we've talked about this when we were talking about building player characters and a little bit of game prep. But there's something really exciting about bringing new players into role-playing. But how do you even pitch it? How do you go about asking someone to join the game? Joe?
Badly.
Joe does it badly.
I do a bad job.
What about anybody else?
Harlan, do you have any answers for the class?
Of course. There's so many ways. There's 2 real hooks. You can either get them hooked into the idea of the story, or you can get them hooked into the idea of being a player.
Or you can show them a character sheet and all the numbers on it and basically just overwhelm them with information until they stop talking to you. But back to what Harlan was saying.
So these are sort of the ways that you can bring someone into the game. At least these are the traditional ways that we've said. Oh, you either hook them on the storyline of your campaign, or you hook them on being a player. But that's not true. There's a third option, and that's hooking them on the idea of what an RPG is. And it's interesting because it's different. when I was introduced, I was brought on being told that I had agency about being a player. Oh, who do you want to be? How do you imagine yourself? Are you a paladin holding your sword? And that didn't really click for me. And then there's the more traditional, okay, the world is dark. A cloud lies above. That's okay. What really sold it for me, and what to me is the easiest way to onboard someone, is to relate it to a tale when we're kids, to sit around a fire. And it's not about the subject matter, and it's not about who you're playing, but about the frame of what you're going to be doing. Imagine you're walking down the street and a car comes out. What do you do? It's sailing right towards you. What do you do?
I jump out of the way.
Perfect. Okay. You jump out of the way and you roll. And as you roll, you realize that there's a manhole that's open and you fall down it. You take a little bit of damage, but you're fine. And as you stand back up, the manhole slides closed. And suddenly there's a growling in the darkness.
Immediately, I'm invested in finding out what happens next. And Harlan has introduced me to the concept of role-playing games without having to explain a thing.
I think what happens is we get really excited about our worlds, or we get really excited about building a player for somebody.
We get precious.
But that's not really what's exciting about an RPG.
Mm-hmm.
What's exciting about an RPG at its core is the ability to do what you want. It's about freedom. It's about, doing anything. And trying to wrap your head around that is really difficult unless you're just sitting across from somebody and they're sort of walking you through it. You walk down a hill, what do you see? And one of the best ways to do this is imagine you're playing with a 5-year-old, which is what we do. A 5-year-old doesn't care about what kind of character he is because he's just playing himself. A 5-year-old doesn't care about the world because, frankly, they just don't know their own world that much. What they like is being asked a question and trying to figure out what they would do. Ooh, would I roll out of the way of the car? Would I try to jump on the hood? What if I lied flat? Could I fit under it? And this, to me, is one of the best ways to onboard somebody, because you can wrap your head around the idea of choice. And it makes the idea, especially for someone who might not normally want to play an RPG, it makes them interested in the idea of just answering yes or no questions to a number of things. Now, that being said, cater to your player and audience. There are absolutely people who say, look, I really want to make a character. I love characters. I have this idea for a character. And then you say, perfect, let's make that character in this setting. And I bet you're going to have a really great time at figuring out exactly what they can do. Or you could be someone who just adores world building. And they're like, oh, nothing is more appealing to me than the world of George R. Martin, R.R. Martin. J.R.R. Tolkien.
Or people who are like, yeah, I want to play inside a Minecraft world. And you're like, great, we can play a Minecraft RPG. No problem. There's your onboard.
Absolutely. And then it becomes about how to balance that character in with the other players. Because rarely, and I mean rarely, are you onboarding a bunch of first-time RPGers. Most often, it's one amongst people who are more familiar with it. And this is where I think it becomes something that a lot of people don't really pay attention to. And it's not just about the relationship you have with the new player, but it's about the relationship the player has with the other players. And understanding that they have a certain role within that party that, unless they have examples or really fully understand, it's a very difficult thing to navigate. It's sort of a nebulous idea. Because you don't have all the information of what a rogue does or what a paladin does. All you know is that here's a character that you're playing. How do I fit into this bigger picture?
Yeah, not just do they not understand what a rogue does, but they also don't understand why they can't just pick a direction, a cardinal direction, and walk off in that direction and expect the story to follow them.
If you're somebody who's onboarding a player who loves characters, if that is their pitch, I would highly recommend asking them to write a backstory. Not a long one, just a few notes. And most importantly, and this is where 99% of GMs fail, use that backstory. Because a lot of game masters will say, backstory, it's for the birds, it doesn't matter, you never use it. Well, guess what? That's your choice as a game master to not use it. I use players' backstories all the time. I absolutely try to work in the missing brother angle from someone whose brother is missing, the lost gem from someone who's looking for a gem. That's your responsibility as a game master to make people involved in your story. If you think backstory doesn't matter, then you're just not doing a good enough job of finding out what your character's backstories are.
Yeah, your players are telling you specifically, here's what matters to my character. And you're saying, don't care about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Wah, wah.
That's on you. And at the end of the day, you're entirely right to kind of be like, that's totally fine. I don't want to work this character's backstory into my story, but then don't be upset that they have no interest in anything bigger than your precious story. I love how we're shitting on the GMs.
Yeah, how dare you? But for real though, sometimes those backstories suck.
Oh, they do. And then you can help them. You can help them make better ones. You know what I mean? Because sometimes they don't really know exactly what they're trying to do. Like I said, it could be a very nebulous concept.
You need like a Microsoft Assistant clippy that's like, are you sure you're an orphan? Did you mean?
It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. So those are the three subjects that we wanted to tackle today: the art of improvisation, mastering the game, and bringing in new players to role playing. I hope we've been helpful. I hope these have been informative. Again, every Tuesday at 7:30. Excuse me, he says. Every Tuesday at 7:30, we're going to be playing Hereafter with the fantastic Jay, Joe, Gary, and Erica.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you want to see some of these practices in practice, you can come and stop by because we try to, show what we preach. Preach what we show.
Say practice one more time.
Practice what we preach. Did I say it too many times?
Nah.
Practice. Either way, Tuesdays at 7:30. Sigil has lots of amazing stuff coming up, so make sure you check it out. Mm-hmm. But for now, that is it from us. Thank you for hanging out with us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a glorious weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.